If there's one thing everybody should understand at this point is that climate change is not a scientific problem. It's a political problem.
Do you remember how bad it was last February during our winter storm? Arctic air froze power plants, shutting them down. The cost of electricity went through the roof. Some water plants, which run on electricity, stopped pumping. It was the most expensive disaster in state history, and at least 210 people died in the cold and the dark. But there's one more domino we need to talk about, and that's climate change. A widely reported paper in the journal Science draws a connection between climate change and the likelihood that Arctic temperatures sagged all the way down to Texas and set off this chain of events. Around the country and the world, governments are and have been making plans to address the risks of climate change. For example, it's been 8 years since the Department of Defense first called climate change a threat multiplier to military operations. And it's the reason world leaders are negotiating rapid cuts in greenhouse gas emissions at a UN summit in Scotland. So, how about Texas? Despite how clear the science is, we found in Governor Greg Abbott's administration there are no major state agencies that have a policy on how climate change impacts state operations and no plans for how to address the risks of a more extreme future.
It's all tied together. Everybody has to worry about everything.
Dr. John Nielsen Gammon is a professor at Texas A&M University. He's the Texas state climatologist, and he's been warning state policymakers about the risk of climate change for years. His latest research says we're headed for a future of more 100-degree days, more extreme rainfall, more urban flooding, more intense hurricanes, more severe drought, and more risk of wildfire. Do you think if your job is to plan and mitigate against future risk, that you must consider climate change?
If you're dealing with risk that's weather sensitive, then yes.
In 2011, Texas was hit with one of the worst droughts in state history. Farmers and ranchers sustained $8 billion in losses. 300 million trees died, and it was the worst year for wildfires ever. John Paul Deneen is a farmer in Waxahachie. How long did it take you to recover from that year?
You know, it may be 2 years after the fact, hopefully, if things go well, before you come back to even to recuperate what you lose in that year.
What is the state of Texas doing to prepare for future droughts? Well, Bodark Lake is the first major new reservoir in Texas in 30 years. Precisely because you can't just build lakes overnight, the state's water plan looks 50 years into the future. The mission is to always have enough water in the case of a drought that's as bad as the worst drought we've ever had. That's called the drought of record. But here's the problem. In a paper called Unprecedented Drought Challenges for Texas, Dr. Nielsen Gammon and others are essentially saying because of climate change, future droughts are likely to be worse than the worst drought we've ever had.
Should the state be planning for something worse than the drought of record at this point?
I think they should. Yeah, you're basically assuming that the drought that's occurred in the past are going to be similar to the droughts in the future, and that's not necessarily a good assumption.
In the Abbott administration, the Texas Water Development Board, appointed by the governor, has no policy on how climate change could impact the state's future water supply. Chairwoman Brooke Popp declined to be interviewed for this story, but in a statement, a representative writes, "Planning groups and local water providers have the flexibility to consider, balance, and address a variety of potential risks and uncertainties, including the risk of a drought worse than the drought of record." In other words, the state agency responsible for water supply says helping to navigate the future risks that Texans face from climate change is not its job. We found the Water Board is one of 9 major state agencies without a policy on how climate change impacts state operations. All are led by commissioners appointed by Governor Abbott. Here are some examples. Climate change degrades air quality and increases ozone levels. In Texas, the Commission on Environmental Quality is responsible for clean air, but it has no policy on how climate change impacts the air that Texans breathe. In a statement, the agency says it uses air monitoring data and a variety of other inputs to develop future projections for air quality in Texas. That said, the agency does not use climate change projections to evaluate future impact on air quality. Hurricanes, heavy rain, and heat are all made worse by climate change, but the Division of Emergency Management, which responds to disasters, has no policy on how climate change will impact the disasters Texans will face. In a statement, the agency says it takes an all-hazards approach to preparedness and is ready to respond to all disasters, whether natural or man-made. More extreme temperatures will likely increase the demand for electricity and could hamper how it's produced and delivered, like we saw last winter. But the Public Utilities Commission, responsible for keeping the lights on in Texas, has no policy on how climate change will impact the reliable energy that Texans count on. In a statement, the agency says Texas has always had highly variable weather, so there is no one-size-fits-all solution. However, any policy decision needs to be made on sound science and data. On multiple occasions, we requested an interview with Governor Abbott. We wanted to ask him why his government has no plans to address the risks that Texans face from climate change. His office did not respond.
You know, the politics of this, if you're a Republican, are very tricky.
Dr. Jim Henson is the director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas in Austin. Even though the science of climate change is rock solid, Henson polled Texans asking, is climate change happening? He found the political divide was enormous. 88% of Democrats said yes, compared to 30% of Republicans.
When everybody adopts a norm that says, you know, we can't really talk about climate change directly or explicitly, that's going to affect the policy discussion. Silence becomes the default option in a polarized environment like this.
Okay, let's get back to that February winter storm.
Senate Business and Commerce Committee will come to order.
After the disaster, lawmakers held hearings to understand how the Public Utility Commission failed to keep the lights on.
From your experience, can we expect more of these phenomena? And specifically, without having but I think we have to put it on the table, global warming.
But when a Democratic lawmaker raised questions about climate change, here's how the Republican chairman responded.
And Senator Whitmire, what we'd like to do in the committee is stick with the events of last week rather than getting, that's a significant discussion.
Chairman,
but
if what he's telling us developed.
Senator Whitmire, we want to really focus on the events of last week rather than get off into a climate change discussion at this point.
The science is clear. Climate change is juicing up the destructiveness of hurricane, drought, and fire. And around the country and the world, governments are making plans to address those risks. But in Texas, the response is silence. The Abbott administration will not talk about climate change and will not use climate science to address the risks that Texans face in the future and do something about it now. I'm David Schechter reporting.